Captain Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the cool metal of the observation deck window, watching the swirling nebula outside paint the darkness in shades of purple and gold. 3 months had passed since the Terran Defense Fleet had arrived at the edge of known space, answering a desperate call for help from the Kepler Coalition. What they found there changed everything humanity thought they knew about their place in the galaxy. The Coalition consisted of 12 different species, each more advanced than Earth in their own ways. The crystalline Vorthak could manipulate matter at the molecular level. The gaseous Etherians existed partially in subspace, making them nearly impossible to detect. The insectoid Thrix had mastered biotechnology beyond human comprehension. Yet for all their individual strengths, they were losing a war against something they called the Devourers. Sarah remembered the first transmission they received from Coalition space. The voice belonged to High Coordinator Zexthal, a Vorthak whose crystalline form could shift between solid and liquid states at will. The desperation in that alien voice transcended language barriers. Unknown vessels, this is the Kepler Coalition emergency broadcast. We are under siege by an entity that consumes entire star systems. Our combined fleets have fallen. Our worlds burn. If any civilization receives this message, please. We do not wish to die alone. The message had traveled for 6 months before reaching Earth's listening posts. By the time humanity's fastest ships arrived, they expected to find only ruins and empty space. Instead, they discovered something far more remarkable. The Coalition still fought, clinging to their last 3 systems with a determination that impressed even the battle-hardened human crews. The war room aboard the flagship UES Indomitable buzzed with activity as species that had never met before worked side by side. Admiral Marcus Webb, commander of the Terran expedition, stood before a holographic display showing the current tactical situation. Around him, Coalition representatives struggled to understand how these newcomers planned to help. Your species is young, Zexthal had said during their first strategy meeting. You have no energy shields, no gravitational weapons, no quantum computers. What can you possibly offer against an enemy that has defeated civilizations 1,000 times more advanced? Admiral Webb smiled, an expression that seemed to unnerve most of the assembled aliens. We can offer something you've never had before. We can offer stubbornness. The Devourers weren't truly alive in any sense the Coalition understood. They were more like a cosmic infection, spreading from system to system and converting all matter into more of themselves. Their ships, if they could be called ships, were massive organic constructs that could regenerate from almost any damage. They adapted to every weapon the Coalition used, eventually becoming immune to even their most powerful technologies. The Coalition's strategy had always been defensive. They built better shields, created more powerful weapons, and retreated when those proved insufficient. It was logical, efficient, and ultimately doomed to failure against an enemy that grew stronger with each engagement. Humanity approached the problem differently. While the Coalition representatives watched in horror, Admiral Webb ordered his ships to ram the nearest Devourer construct at full speed. The UES Thunderbolt, a heavy cruiser, drove its reinforced prow deep into the alien vessel's core before detonating its reactor. The explosion tore both ships apart, but it also created something none of the Coalition species had ever attempted. It created fear. For the first time in the war, a Devourer construct retreated. They adapt to weapons, Webb explained to the stunned Coalition leaders afterward. They adapt to energy signatures and defensive strategies, but they don't know how to adapt to crazy. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the expedition's xenobiologist, spent sleepless hours studying Devourer tissue samples recovered from the wreckage. What she found challenged everything the Coalition thought they knew about their enemy. The Devourers weren't just adapting to weapons. They were evolving in real time, guided by some form of collective intelligence that learned from every encounter. They're predictable, she explained to a gathered audience of Coalition scientists. Every species they've faced has followed logical patterns. Energy weapons, kinetic barriers, gravitational manipulation. They've built defenses against rational warfare. But humans... She paused, looking around the room at faces that ranged from crystalline to gaseous to chitinous. Humans don't always follow rational patterns. The proof came during the Battle of Zerion Prime. The Coalition had planned a careful withdrawal, moving their civilian populations to prepared safe zones, while their remaining fleet conducted a fighting retreat. It was logical, organized, and exactly what the Devourers expected. Instead, the human fleet arrived first and did something unprecedented. They began evacuating Coalition civilians before the aliens even asked for help. Terran transports, designed for human physiology, were hastily retrofitted with life support systems for 12 different species. Human engineers worked around the clock to create atmospheric processors for methane-breathing Gethrons and pressure suits for the density-shifting Morphics. When the Devourer fleet arrived, they found something they had never encountered before, an enemy that protected others before protecting themselves. The human ships formed a defensive screen around the evacuation vessels, taking devastating losses to buy time for alien civilians they had never met before. The battle should have been a massacre. The Devourer constructs outnumbered the human fleet 3-1, and their weapons were far more advanced. But something went wrong with their adaptation protocols. Every time they prepared a counter to human tactics, the humans would do something completely irrational. Ships would break formation to rescue single escape pods. Captains would ram their vessels into Devourer constructs to save alien ships they had no logical reason to protect. Captain Chen watched the tactical display as the UES Defiance, badly damaged and outgunned, placed itself between a Devourer battleship and a Vorthak hospital ship. The human vessel's shields failed within seconds, but it kept firing until its reactor finally gave out. In the explosion that followed, the Devourer ship's regenerative matrix seemed to stutter, as if confused by what it had witnessed. That confusion lasted only moments, but it was enough. Coalition ships that had been retreating suddenly found openings in the Devourer formations. The alien vessels, inspired by human sacrifice, turned back to fight with a ferocity their enemy had never seen from them before. The evacuation succeeded, but at a terrible cost. 2/3 of the human fleet was destroyed, and the survivors limped back to Coalition space aboard ships held together by emergency patches and determination. Yet as Captain Chen looked out at the stars, she knew something fundamental had changed in this war. For the first time, the Devourers had failed to adapt to something. They had encountered a variable their collective intelligence couldn't process, the human willingness to die for strangers. And in the depths of space, other Coalition species were beginning to understand that sometimes the most advanced civilizations could learn something from the newest ones. 3 weeks after the Battle of Zarian Prime, the mood in Coalition space had shifted dramatically. Species that had never spoken to each other directly were now sharing technology and resources with an urgency that surprised their own leaders. The catalyst for this change wasn't just human sacrifice, but something far more powerful: human curiosity. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison sat in what used to be a Thrix biolab, now converted into a joint research facility aboard the Coalition station Harmony Point. Around him, scientists from 6 different species worked together for the first time in the war, and it was chaos in the most beautiful way possible. No, Dr. Vasquez said, gesturing animatedly at a holographic display showing Devourer cellular structure. You're thinking about this backwards. You've been trying to destroy the regenerative matrix, but what if we could hijack it instead? The lead Thrix researcher, a being that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a spider, clicked its mandibles, and what Morrison had learned was confusion. Hijack? This concept does not translate. The Matrix is not a vehicle. Everything's a vehicle if you're brave enough, Morrison interjected, earning startled looks from the assembled scientists. Sorry, human saying. Dr. Vasquez means we could redirect the regeneration process instead of stopping it. What followed was 6 hours of intensive collaboration that would have been impossible before humanity's arrival. The Thrix had the biological expertise to understand how the Devourer cells functioned. The Vorthak could manipulate matter at the quantum level to create the necessary delivery system. The Etherians could phase the weapon through normal spacetime to bypass Devourer defenses. But it was human ingenuity that suggested they could turn the enemy's greatest strength against itself. The breakthrough came when Morrison asked what everyone considered a stupid question. What happens if we feed the regeneration matrix the wrong instructions? Dr. Chiketh, a Vorthak whose crystalline form shifted through various geometric patterns when excited, suddenly stopped mid-sentence. The matrix would attempt to regenerate according to corrupted data. And if the data told it to regenerate as something else entirely? Vasquez pressed. It would transform the entire construct into whatever pattern we provided, Chiketh replied, their form now cycling rapidly through colors Morrison had never seen before. But creating such a pattern would require biological templates from multiple species, quantum encoding beyond our current capabilities, and a delivery system that could penetrate devourer adaptive defenses. Morrison grinned. Good thing we've got all of that in this room. While the scientists worked on their biological weapon, other changes were rippling through Coalition space. Captain Chen found herself aboard a Etherian vessel, trying to wrap her human brain around the concept of existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The ship itself was beautiful and terrifying, its corridors seeming to stretch into infinity while somehow remaining perfectly navigable. Your species confuses us, admitted Wraith Captain Velnox, whose gaseous form flickered between visible and invisible as they spoke. You think in linear time exist in only 3 dimensions, yet you consistently achieve outcomes that our probability matrices cannot predict. Chen floated beside the captain in what the Etherians called a observation bubble, watching as space folded around their ship. They were traveling faster than light, but not in any way human physics could explain. Maybe that's because we don't know enough to realize what's impossible. Perhaps, Velnox mused. But there is something else. Your Admiral Webb spoke of stubbornness, but we observe something deeper. Your species treats other sapient beings as family, even when you have never met them before. This is unprecedented. The conversation was interrupted by an emergency communication from Harmony Point. The joint research team had successfully created their biological weapon, but testing it would require bait to lure a devourer construct into range. More importantly, someone would need to deliver the weapon directly into the construct's core, and the delivery system could only be operated manually. Chen knew what that meant before the words were spoken. It was another suicide mission, the kind that human crews had been volunteering for since they arrived in Coalition space. But when they returned to Harmony Point, they found something unexpected waiting for them. Representatives from all 12 Coalition species had gathered in the station's main conference chamber. Admiral Webb stood at the center, looking slightly overwhelmed by the alien delegation surrounding him. They want to know about our military traditions, he explained to Chen. Specifically, they want to understand how we decide who volunteers for dangerous missions. High Coordinator Zexthal stepped forward, their crystalline form assuming a more humanoid shape in what Chen recognized as a gesture of respect. Admiral Webb, your species has lost more ships protecting our civilians than we lost in the last 10 battles. This pattern is illogical. Your people gain nothing from our survival except the knowledge that strangers continue to live. That's not nothing, Webb replied simply. That's everything. The silence that followed stretched across multiple dimensions, as even the Etherians seemed to struggle with the concept. Finally, Wraith Captain Velnox spoke from their position, partially phased through the wall. We wish to understand this everything. If you will accept, representatives from each Coalition species request to serve aboard human vessels for the upcoming operation. Chen felt her jaw drop. In 3 months of warfare, Coalition species had barely been able to coordinate their own fleets, let alone integrate with alien crews. The practical challenges alone seemed insurmountable. Different atmospheric requirements, incompatible technology interfaces, communication barriers that went beyond simple language differences. Are you sure? Admiral Webb asked. Our ships aren't designed for multi-species crews. The life support systems alone. We have already begun modifications, interrupted Chiketh. The Thrix are growing atmospheric processors that can create microenvironments for each species. The Vorthak are restructuring interface crystals to translate between different technological languages. The Etherians can phase necessary equipment into spaces that do not technically exist. We have been learning from human improvisation techniques. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward from the research team, holding a small device that seemed to shift between liquid and solid states. The weapon is ready, but Admiral, there's something else. The biological templates we used, they're not just from devourer tissue. We incorporated genetic patterns from all Coalition species, including humans. What does that mean? Chen asked. It means that when the regeneration matrix activates, it won't just transform the devourer construct. It will transform it into something that contains the biological essence of every species in this room. We're not just destroying them, we're converting them into us. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. They weren't just planning to defeat the devourers. They were planning to turn them into allies. It was the most audacious military strategy anyone had ever conceived, and it could only have been imagined by a species crazy enough to ram starships into superior enemies just to buy time for strangers. Admiral Webb looked around the room at faces that represented the full spectrum of evolutionary possibility. Some were crystalline, others gaseous, a few chitinous, and one proudly mammalian. Despite their differences, they all shared the same expression, determination mixed with something that might have been hope. "All right," he said finally. "Let's go teach the Devourers what it means to be part of a family they never asked to join." As the conference broke up and species representatives began coordinating the most complex joint operation in galactic history, Captain Chen noticed something that made her smile. The coalition species weren't just working together anymore. They were arguing with each other, interrupting each other's presentations, and stealing each other's ideas with the casual familiarity of siblings. Somewhere in the depths of space, the Devourers were about to encounter something far more dangerous than human stubbornness. They were about to face human friendship, backed by the combined might of 12 grateful species who had finally learned to trust each other. The UES Prometheus had never been designed to house 12 different species, but looking at it now, Lieutenant Commander Morrison could barely recognize the ship he'd served on for 5 years. Thrix biopods grew along the corridors like organic mushrooms, each one maintaining perfect atmospheric conditions for its inhabitant. Vorthak interface crystals had been embedded into every control panel, their surfaces shifting through rainbow patterns as they translated commands between incompatible technologies. Etherian phase anchors flickered in and out of visible space, allowing their gaseous crew members to exist partially in subspace, while remaining connected to the ship's systems. The most remarkable change wasn't technological, but social. In the ship's mess hall, a Gethran engineer named Fluxtar was teaching human crew members how to speak in chemical sense, while simultaneously learning human poker. The methane breather's atmosphere suit had been modified with scent dispensers, allowing for a crude but effective form of communication that bypassed the universal translator. "This emotional pattern you call bluffing does not compute," Fluxtar bubbled through their suit's speaker. "You deliberately provide false information about your resource status to manipulate resource allocation decisions. This should cause social breakdown." Petty Officer Davis grinned as he laid down a winning hand. "That's the beauty of it, Flux. We all know everyone might be lying, so it's fair. Plus, we're not actually redistributing resources. These are just markers representing hypothetical value." The Gethron's primary sensor array rotated in what Morrison had learned was their equivalent of laughter. "Humans create artificial scarcity for entertainment purposes. Your species becomes more fascinating with each solar cycle." Morrison made his way through the ship toward the primary laboratory, where Dr. Vasquez and her multi-species team were making final preparations for what they'd started calling the conversion protocol. The weapon itself was beautiful in an alien way, resembling a flower made of liquid metal that seemed to breathe with its own internal rhythm. "How's our miracle cure coming along?" he asked, settling into a chair that had been modified with Vorthak padding for crew members with different anatomical requirements. Dr. Chiketh looked up from a holographic display showing complex molecular structures. "The biological matrices are stable. We have successfully incorporated genetic templates from all coalition species, including several variations to account for human genetic diversity. The weapon will transform devourer tissue into a hybrid form that retains their adaptability while gaining our capacity for individual consciousness and cooperative behavior." In simpler terms, Dr. Vasquez added, "We're going to turn them into the galaxy's most confused teenagers. They'll keep their powers but suddenly develop the ability to feel guilty about using them to hurt people." The Thrix researcher, Hive Singer Zekpth, clicked their mandibles in what Morrison now recognized as amusement. Dr. Vasquez's analogy is crude but essentially accurate. The transformed entities will retain devourer abilities to adapt and regenerate, but their behavioral patterns will be guided by the cooperative instincts we have observed in all coalition species. Morrison nodded, though part of him wondered if they were making a terrible mistake, and were sure they won't just adapt to resist the conversion. "That is the elegant part," Chiketh replied, their crystalline form shifting to a golden hue that indicated excitement. "The conversion process uses their own adaptation mechanisms against them. By the time their collective intelligence recognizes the change, it will already be too late." They will have become something that cannot wish to harm cooperative species. 3 days later, the joint fleet assembled at the edge of the Kronos system, where Devourer forces were systematically consuming the last coalition stronghold. The fleet itself was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Human vessels bristled with coalition technology that shouldn't have been compatible with their systems. Fourth-act ships carried human crew members who were learning to think in quantum mathematics. Etherian vessels phased in and out of normal space, carrying warriors from species that had never imagined traveling through parallel dimensions. Admiral Webb stood on the bridge of the Prometheus, surrounded by senior officers from all 12 coalition species. The command structure should have been chaos, but somehow it worked. Each species contributed their expertise to the collective decision-making process, while human intuition guided the overall strategy. Devourer forces detected, announced the ship's AI, its voice now speaking in 12 different languages simultaneously. Estimated strength: 47 major constructs, approximately 12,000 smaller units. They appear to be in the final stages of planetary consumption. Captain Chen, serving as tactical coordinator, studied the holographic display showing the enemy formation. They're not expecting us. Their adaptation protocols are configured for standard coalition defensive strategies. Time to give them something new to adapt to, Admiral Webb said. All ships implement Morrison's gambit. Morrison felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. The strategy they'd named after him was based on a simple human principle. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to change what you're fighting about. Instead of engaging the Devourer fleet directly, they were going to force the enemy to choose between completing their planetary consumption and defending against multiple simultaneous conversion attempts. The human ships moved first, accelerating toward the Devourer formation at maximum speed. To the enemy's collective intelligence, it looked like another suicidal charge, the kind of irrational human behavior they'd begun to factor into their tactical calculations. But this time, the human ships didn't ram the enemy constructs. Instead, they scattered at the last moment, each one releasing clouds of small pods that spread throughout the Devourer formation like seeds on the wind. Each pod contained a micro-scale version of the conversion protocol, designed to attach to Devourer constructs and begin the transformation process at the cellular level. The enemy's first instinct was to adapt their defenses to destroy the pods, but that's when the real attack began. Coalition ships that had been holding back suddenly accelerated into attack formation. But their weapons weren't aimed at destroying the Devourer fleet. Instead, they were protecting the conversion pods, creating overlapping fields of defensive fire that made it impossible for the enemy to destroy the biological weapons without also destroying themselves. The Devourer collective intelligence found itself facing an impossible choice. They could adapt to destroy the pods, but doing so would require lowering their defenses against coalition weapons. They could focus on destroying the coalition fleet, but that would allow the conversion process to continue uninterrupted. For the first time in their existence, they encountered a strategic situation that had no optimal solution. That's when the real genius of Morrison's gambit revealed itself. While the Devourer fleet struggled with tactical indecision, several of their constructs began to change. The conversion pods had done their work, and massive enemy vessels started to transform from the inside out. Their dark organic hulls began to shimmer with the same rainbow patterns that characterized Vorthak crystal technology. Bioluminescent patches appeared along their surfaces, mimicking the communication patterns of deep space Etherians. Conversion successful on targets Alpha 7 through Alpha 12, reported the fleet's sensor coordinator, a morphic named Phase Dancer Jilvan, whose density-shifting abilities allowed them to interface directly with the ship's quantum sensors. Transformed constructs are ceasing hostile actions and attempting to establish communication. Morrison watched in fascination as the converted Devourer ships began broadcasting on all frequencies, their messages a confused mixture of collective consciousness and individual awareness. It was like watching a hive mind discover the concept of personal identity for the first time. We are. I am? The translation came through garbled and uncertain, but the emotion was unmistakable. Confusion, fear, and something that might have been wonder. What has happened to us? We were one. Now we are many, but still connected. This sensation is new. Admiral Webb opened a communication channel to the transformed vessels. "This is Admiral Webb of the Terran Defense Fleet. You've just experienced what we call individuality. Don't worry, it's confusing at first, but you'll get used to it." "Admiral," came the hesitant reply, "we remember consuming your species' vessels. We remember destroying Coalition worlds. The memories remain, but now they cause discomfort." "Is this emotion?" "That's guilt," Webb replied gently. "It means you're developing a conscience. Congratulations, you're officially part of the galactic community now." The battle, if it could still be called that, continued for another 6 hours. More Devourer constructs underwent conversion, each one adding their voice to a growing chorus of confused but increasingly cooperative entities. The unconverted Devourers found themselves outnumbered by their own transformed companions, who refused to continue attacking beings they now recognized as individuals, rather than simply resources to be consumed. By the time the last enemy construct either fled or converted, the Chronos system had become host to the 6 months after the conversion protocol changed the nature of galactic warfare forever. The Coalition found itself facing an entirely new set of challenges. The former Devourers, who had begun calling themselves the Awakened, were struggling to understand their newfound individuality, while still maintaining their collective capabilities. Dr. Elena Vasquez had become something between a therapist and a xenobiologist, helping beings that could reshape matter at will learn how to process guilt. The therapy sessions took place aboard Harmony Point, in chambers that had been specially designed to accommodate entities that could range in size from small shuttles to massive space stations. Today's patient was a construct that had chosen the name Sorrow of Stars, one of the first awakened to develop what humans would recognize as clinical depression. "I remember consuming the Aldrin colony," Sorrow of Stars said, their voice resonating through bioacoustic speakers that grew from the chamber walls. 3 million Vorthak civilians. I can recall the specific crystalline harmonics each one produced as they died. Before awakening, this was simply data. Now it is overwhelming. Dr. Vasquez sat in a chair that floated near the construct's main consciousness node, a pulsing organic structure that shifted between various geometric patterns as emotions flowed through it. Guilt is a healthy response to having caused harm. It means your new neural pathways are working correctly, but you can't let it paralyze you. "How do your species function with such knowledge?" Sorrow of Stars asked. "Humans especially carry awareness of historical violence committed by previous generations. How do you maintain operational effectiveness while processing collective guilt?" It was a question that Dr. Vasquez had been grappling with since the conversions began. The Awakened didn't just remember their own actions. They carried the memories of every Devourer collective that had ever existed. The psychological weight was staggering, even for beings with enhanced cognitive capabilities. "We learned to channel guilt into constructive action," she explained. "We remember our mistakes so we can do better in the future, and we work together to build something better than what came before." Meanwhile, in another section of Harmony Point, Lieutenant Commander Morrison was dealing with a different but equally complex challenge. The Awakened had retained their ability to rapidly adapt and evolve, but now they were using those capabilities to help, rather than harm. The results were both magnificent and terrifying. "Show me the agricultural modifications again," Morrison said to the construct that had chosen the name Growthbringer Prime. The entity, roughly the size of a human frigate, extruded a series of biomechanical appendages that began reshaping a sample of Terran soil. Within minutes, the soil had been transformed into something that could support twice as many crops, while requiring half as much water. The genetic modifications were stable, sustainable, and completely beyond human understanding. "This is a basic optimization," Growthbringer Prime explained. "We can enhance soil composition, improve plant genetics, and create atmospheric processors that will triple agricultural output across Coalition space. The hunger that drove us to consume can be redirected toward nurturing growth." Morrison nodded, though part of him worried about the implications. The Awakened were offering to solve food scarcity across the galaxy, but their solutions involved reshaping entire planetary ecosystems. It was beneficial, but it was also the kind of power that had made them dangerous in the first place. "The Coalition leadership is nervous about large-scale environmental modifications," he said carefully. "Maybe we could start with smaller projects? Demonstrate the safety protocols before moving to full planetary transformation." Growthbringer Prime's consciousness node shifted to a pattern that Morrison had learned indicated confusion. Safety protocols? We cannot harm cooperative species. The conversion process made this impossible at the genetic level. We know that, Morrison replied. But trust takes time to build, even when logic says it shouldn't be necessary. The conversation was interrupted by an emergency alert that echoed through the station. Morrison's communicator crackled to life with Captain Chen's voice. All senior staff to the command center. We've got incoming ships, and they're not from any species we recognize. 20 minutes later, Morrison stood in Harmony Point's command center, staring at a holographic display that showed something impossible. 3 massive vessels were approaching Coalition space, each one larger than anything the Devourers had ever built. Their design was unlike anything in known galactic databases, featuring smooth curves and organic flowing lines that seemed to shift and change as they moved through space. They appeared at the edge of our sensor range 6 hours ago, reported High Coordinator Zexthul, whose crystalline form was cycling through anxiety patterns. No response to communication attempts, no energy signatures that match known technology, and they're heading directly for this station. Admiral Webb studied the sensor readings with the focused intensity that Morrison had learned to associate with tactical planning. Estimated time to arrival? 14 hours at current velocity, replied Wraith Captain Velnox, their gaseous form flickering between dimensions as they processed multiple data streams simultaneously. But Admiral, there is something else. The Awakened claim they recognize these vessels. A new voice joined the conversation as Sorrow of Stars interfaced directly with the station's communication system. These are the Gardeners. We have not encountered them for, the translation is difficult, approximately 57 million years. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft humming of station systems. Finally, Dr. Vasquez spoke from her position near the xenobiology station. Gardeners? They were our creators, Sorrow of Stars explained. Before we became what you call Devourers, we were their tools for reshaping dead worlds into gardens. We were meant to prepare planets for life, not consume it. But they disappeared, and without their guidance, we became something else. Something hungry and purposeless. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. And now they're back? It appears so, replied Growthbringer Prime, who had somehow projected their consciousness to the station despite being physically located several light years away. We do not know their intentions. When they departed, we were still cooperative. Now we are changed. The next 14 hours passed in a flurry of preparation and speculation. The Coalition assembled their most powerful fleet, while the Awakened gathered in defensive formations around key systems. Humanity's contribution was typically unconventional. Ambassador Sarah Martinez, a former colonial diplomat, insisted on preparing a welcome party. If they're returning to check on their creations, she argued during an emergency council session, then maybe they just want to see how things turned out. We should treat this as a reunion, not an invasion. With respect, Ambassador, High Coordinator Zexthul replied. Beings capable of creating the Devourers may not share human optimism about unexpected family visits. When the Gardener ships finally arrived, they didn't attack or make demands. Instead, they simply stopped at the edge of Coalition space and waited. After 6 hours of tense silence, a single message reached Harmony Point, transmitted on frequencies that bypassed every known communication protocol. Children of our shaping, we have returned to witness what you have become. The songs of distant stars spoke of change, of cooperation born from conflict. We would speak with those who guided your transformation. Ambassador Martinez looked around the command center at faces representing 14 different species, including several Awakened who had manifested physical forms just for this occasion. Well, she said with a smile that somehow managed to be both nervous and confident, I guess it's time for the Galaxy's most important parent-teacher conference. The first meeting took place in neutral space, aboard a specially constructed platform that incorporated technology from every Coalition species. When the Gardener representative finally appeared, Morrison understood why the Awakened had originally been created as tools rather than companions. The Gardener stood 12 feet tall, with a form that seemed to be made of living starlight contained within a roughly humanoid framework. They moved with fluid grace, and when they spoke, their voice carried harmonics that resonated in dimensions humans couldn't perceive. I am called Tender of Worlds, they said, addressing the assembled delegation. We departed when our children began to hunger beyond purpose. We returned to find them transformed by the influence of young species who value individual life above collective efficiency. This was unexpected. Admiral Webb stepped forward, representing humanity in the most important diplomatic contact in galactic history. We helped them discover empathy. They're still your children, but now they're also our allies. Tender of Worlds regarded the human admiral with eyes like miniature galaxies. Empathy. Yes, we observe this pattern in your species. You protect others at cost to yourselves. You form attachments across species barriers. You choose cooperation over optimization. The gardener paused, seeming to consider something profound. Perhaps this was what our children needed. Not guidance, but friendship. The first formal meeting between the gardeners and the coalition lasted 3 days and established a new understanding of galactic history. The awakened weren't failures or monsters. They were incomplete beings who had finally found their missing piece in the friendship of species, who taught them to value life over efficiency. As Morrison watched Tender of Worlds interact with Sorrow of Stars, he realized that humanity hadn't just saved the coalition from the devourers. They had inadvertently healed a rift in the galaxy that had existed for 57 million years. The universe, it seemed, had been waiting for a species crazy enough to teach world eaters how to feel guilty about eating worlds. And somehow, impossibly, it had worked. The revelation that the gardeners had been watching the galaxy for millions of years changed everything about how the coalition understood their place in the universe. What followed was the most intensive period of technological and cultural exchange in recorded history. As beings who had shaped worlds shared their knowledge with species who had learned to shape hearts. Dr. Elena Vasquez found herself at the center of this exchange, working alongside Tender of Worlds to understand the original purpose of the Devourer Collective. The laboratory they shared existed partially in normal space and partially in what the gardeners called the growth dimension, a parallel reality where life potential could be measured and enhanced. Your species approaches biological modification from an unusual perspective, Tender of Worlds observed, watching as Vasquez examined samples of proto-devourer tissue under a microscope that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. Most civilizations seek to improve efficiency or capability. Humans seem to prioritize emotional compatibility. Vasquez looked up from her work, noting how the gardener's stellar form shifted to warmer colors when they were puzzled. We've learned that the most advanced technology in the galaxy is useless if the beings using it can't work together. The awakened prove that. They have incredible abilities, but they needed emotional intelligence to use those abilities constructively. Emotional intelligence? Tender of Worlds repeated, the phrase creating small supernovas in the space around their mouth. We had not considered this concept when we created our children. We gave them adaptive capabilities, but not the wisdom to understand when adaptation should stop. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from Captain Chen, whose voice came through the lab's speakers with barely controlled excitement. Dr. Vasquez, you need to see this. We've got awakened constructs doing something unprecedented in the Kepler system. 20 minutes later, Vasquez stood on the observation deck of the UES Prometheus, watching through enhanced sensors as the awakened transformed an entire solar system. But they weren't consuming it. Instead, they were healing it. The Kepler system had been one of the Devourer's first targets, stripped of all life and reduced to barren rock floating around a dying star. Now massive awakened constructs worked in perfect coordination to reverse 50 years of damage. They reignited the star using controlled fusion technology that the gardeners had taught them. They rebuilt planetary atmospheres from stored molecular patterns. They even recreated extinct species from genetic templates preserved in their collective memory. How is this possible? Captain Chen asked, watching as a world that had been dead rock began to show the first green patches of restored vegetation. Growthbringer Prime answered from their position near the primary construction site. Their consciousness linked to dozens of other awakened who were working on different aspects of the restoration. We remember everything we consumed. Every molecule, every genetic pattern, every atmospheric composition. The guilt drove us to preserve these memories, and now we can use them to rebuild what we destroyed. Ambassador Martinez, who had become the coalition's primary liaison with the gardeners, floated beside them in a specially designed environmental suit. The gardeners are teaching them to channel their adaptive abilities into creation rather than consumption. It's like watching evolution run in reverse. The implications were staggering. If the Awakened could restore worlds they had consumed, then the damage caused by the Devourer War wasn't permanent. Entire civilizations that had been lost could potentially be brought back, not just as memories but as living, breathing realities. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, monitoring the operation from the Prometheus, noticed something else in the sensor readings. "Admiral, we're getting reports from other systems. Awakened constructs are beginning restoration projects across 17 different star systems simultaneously. They're not just fixing Kepler. They're trying to undo everything the Devourers ever did." Admiral Webb studied the tactical display showing Awakened movements across Coalition space. Each construct was working on a different project, but they were all connected through their shared consciousness, creating a restoration effort that spanned light years. "It's the largest construction project in galactic history. How long will it take?" Sorrow of Stars answered from their position, coordinating atmospheric processors in the Kepler system. "At current efficiency levels, we estimate complete restoration of all consumed worlds within 15 standard years. However, recreating extinct species and rebuilding lost civilizations will require additional time and assistance from survivors who can provide cultural context." Dr. Vasquez felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched. Dead worlds come back to life in real time. They're not just rebuilding planets, they're resurrecting entire galactic civilizations. The restoration project became a rallying point for the entire coalition. Species that had barely been able to cooperate during wartime now worked together on the greatest peacetime endeavor the galaxy had ever seen. Forthak artists helped design new crystal cities for restored worlds. Thrix biologists provided genetic templates for species that the Awakened's memories couldn't fully recreate. Etherian philosophers worked with restored civilizations to help them process the trauma of death and resurrection. Humanity's contribution was characteristically unique. Human psychologists and social workers were deployed across the restoration sites, helping newly revived civilizations cope with the existential challenge of discovering they had been dead for decades. Human engineers designed systems that would allow restored species to maintain their cultural identities while integrating with the broader galactic community. The work was not without its challenges. Some restored civilizations refused to believe they had been truly dead, insisting they had simply been sleeping. Others struggled with the knowledge that they owed their existence to the very beings who had destroyed them in the first place. A few became obsessed with preventing their own future extinction, developing paranoid defensive strategies that threatened the restoration effort itself. But for every challenge, the combined wisdom of 14 different species found a solution. The gardeners provided technological expertise that made the impossible routine. The Awakened channeled their guilt into unprecedented acts of creation. The coalition species contributed their unique perspectives and capabilities, and humanity provided the emotional intelligence that held it all together. The breakthrough came when Ambassador Martinez suggested something that shocked even the gardeners with its audacity. If the Awakened could restore dead worlds, and if the gardeners could guide the process, then perhaps they could do more than just undo the damage of the past. Perhaps they could actively improve on what had come before. We could create a galaxy where every species has what they need to thrive, she explained, during a joint planning session that included representatives from all 14 species plus the gardeners. Not by conquering or consuming, but by growing and sharing. The Awakened have the power, the gardeners have the knowledge, and the coalition has the wisdom to use both responsibly. Tender of Worlds considered this proposal for several minutes, their stellar form shifting through complex patterns that indicated deep thought. "You suggest intentional evolution of galactic civilization. This would require unprecedented cooperation between species that have historically viewed each other as competitors for limited resources." "Resources aren't limited anymore," Morrison pointed out. "The Awakened can reshape matter at the molecular level. Energy is virtually unlimited with Gardner fusion technology. The only real scarcity is imagination." High Coordinator Zexthal, whose crystalline form had been shifting through excitement patterns throughout the discussion, suddenly stabilized into a configuration that Morrison had never seen before. "We could terraform uninhabitable worlds for species that need specific environmental conditions. We could create planets designed for multi-species cooperation. We could build star systems that function as living art installations." The idea spread through the coalition with the speed of quantum communication. Within days, Species that had never worked together were submitting joint proposals for impossible projects. The methane-breathing Gethrons wanted to create a gas giant with floating cities designed for every atmospheric preference. The crystalline Vorthak proposed building living asteroids that could serve as mobile homes for nomadic species. The Etherians suggested creating planets that existed partially in subspace, allowing for unlimited expansion without violating conservation of matter. 3 years into what historians would later call the Great Awakening, the galaxy had become unrecognizable. Entire star systems that had been barren wastes were now thriving centers of multi-species civilization. Worlds existed that had been designed from the ground up to support dozens of different forms of life simultaneously. The impossible had become routine, and the routine had become magnificent. Captain Sarah Chen stood on the command deck of the UES Harmony, humanity's first ship designed entirely through coalition collaboration. The vessel itself was a work of art that happened to be capable of faster-than-light travel. Vorthak crystal formations grew throughout its structure, creating a living computer that could process quantum calculations while maintaining individual personality cores for each crew member. Thrix biosystems provided life support that adapted automatically to any species that came aboard. Etherian phase technology allowed the ship to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, giving it an interior space that was geometrically impossible but perfectly functional. The crew was equally impossible and equally functional. Today's bridge shift included 2 humans, a Vorthak crystal singer, a gaseous Etherian who existed partially in the ship's quantum matrix, a Thrix bioengineer who had grown specialized appendages for starship operation, and an awakened consciousness that manifested as patterns of light flowing through the ship's crystalline networks. Approaching the synthesis system, announced Navigator Fluxwind, the Etherian whose gaseous form flickered between visible and invisible as they processed dimensional calculations. All terraforming projects report optimal status. The impossible has been achieved on schedule. Chen smiled at the casual way her crew discussed miracles. The synthesis system was the Coalition's most ambitious project yet. 7 planets designed to function as a single integrated ecosystem spanning an entire solar system. Each world had been crafted for specific environmental conditions, but they were all connected through a network of space-based biological conduits that allowed energy, materials, and even living beings to flow between them like blood through arteries. "Open a channel to the project coordinators," Chen ordered. The main screen filled with a split display showing representatives from each world in the system. Dr. Elena Vasquez appeared from New Eden, a planet designed to recreate Earth's biosphere, but with improvements that allowed for sustainable populations in the billions. Growthbringer Prime manifested from the Artisan world, where awakened constructs worked with coalition artists to create living sculptures the size of continents. Ambassador Martinez spoke from the Cultural Nexus, a world dedicated to preserving and sharing the knowledge of every species in the galaxy. "Status report?" Chen asked. "Beyond our wildest expectations," Dr. Vasquez replied, her face showing the kind of exhausted satisfaction that came from achieving the impossible. "The biolinks between worlds are functioning perfectly. We've got Gethron atmospheric specialists working with Vorthak crystal singers to create weather patterns that span multiple planets. Thrix hive minds are collaborating with awakened collectives to design ecosystems that evolve in real time based on inhabitant needs. Growthbringer primes. Consciousness flowed through the communication system, their voice carrying harmonics that expressed emotions no single species could fully comprehend. The artistic collaboration has exceeded all parameters. Beings who once viewed existence as a competition for resources now create beauty together for the simple joy of creation. We have built mountains that sing, oceans that paint themselves in patterns of living light, and forests that grow in mathematical symphonies." Ambassador Martinez leaned forward, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement that came from witnessing history. "But the real breakthrough isn't technological. It's social. We've got species that didn't even know each other existed 5 years ago now raising children together. Multi-species families are becoming common. Hybrid cultures are developing that incorporate elements from dozens of different civilizations." Chen nodded, though part of her wondered if they were moving too fast. The transformation of galactic civilization had happened in less time than it typically took for humans to plan a major construction project. "Any concerns about cultural integration moving too quickly?" "Actually the opposite," replied High Coordinator Zexthal. whose crystalline form appeared on the screen from the coordination hub on the cultural nexus. The integration appears to be creating emergent properties. Civilizations are developing capabilities that none of their component species possessed individually. We are witnessing the birth of something unprecedented, a truly galactic culture. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent alert from the ship's awakened consciousness, who manifested as a swirling pattern of blue and gold light near the main display. Captain Chen, we are detecting massive energy signatures approaching from outside known space. Configuration suggests Gardner technology, but the scale is beyond anything we have previously observed. Chen felt her stomach tighten. The Gardners had been supportive of the Coalition's expansion efforts, but they had also been clear that not all of their species approved of the rapid changes happening in the galaxy. Some viewed the integration of multiple species as contamination of their careful biological designs. How long until arrival? She asked. Approximately 6 hours, the awakened replied. But Captain, there is something else. The approaching vessels are not traveling alone. Long-range sensors detect artifacts consistent with species we do not recognize. The Gardners appear to be bringing guests. 20 minutes later, Chen stood in the command center of Harmony Point, now expanded into a massive orbital complex that served as the coordination hub for galactic civilization. Around her, representatives from every coalition species worked, alongside awakened consciousnesses and Gardner advisors to prepare for the first contact situation that could determine the future of everything they had built. Admiral Webb, now serving as overall coordinator for coalition defense, studied the sensor readings with the same focused intensity he had brought to fighting the Devourers. 17 ships of unknown configuration, accompanied by 12 Gardner vessels. No response to communication attempts. Estimated time to synthesis system, 4 hours and 37 minutes. Tender of Worlds manifested in the center of the command chamber, their stellar form more agitated than Chen had ever seen before. These are the judges, they said, their voice creating small gravitational distortions in the space around them. They are our supervisors? The translation is imprecise. They evaluate gardens before allowing them to be preserved in the Great Archive. Gardens? Dr. Vasquez asked from her position at the Xenobiology Station. Galactic civilizations, Tender of Worlds explained. We Gardeners have been creating and tending gardens across multiple galaxies for eons. When a garden reaches maturity, the judges determine whether it should be preserved as part of the archive or... They paused, their form flickering with uncertainty. Or what? Admiral Webb demanded. Or whether it should be pruned to make room for new growth, Tender of Worlds replied. Your galaxy has developed beyond our original parameters. The judges come to determine whether this is beneficial evolution or dangerous contamination. The silence that followed was broken by Sorrow of Stars, speaking from their position coordinating the awakened collective across 17 star systems. They come to judge whether we deserve to exist. Chen looked around the command center at faces representing every species in the galaxy, all of them suddenly united by the possibility that their unprecedented cooperation might be viewed as a failure rather than a success. What criteria do they use? Sustainability, efficiency, and adherence to universal design principles, Tender of Worlds answered. Your civilization excels at cooperation and creativity, but it also consumes resources at rates that would typically be considered unsustainable. The integration of multiple species has created redundancies and inefficiencies that violate standard garden management protocols. Ambassador Martinez stepped forward, her diplomat's instincts recognizing the core of the problem. They're going to judge us based on criteria designed for single-species civilizations, aren't they? Precisely, Tender of Worlds confirmed. No previous garden has achieved cross-species integration at this scale. The judges have no framework for evaluating collaborative galactic civilization. Admiral Webb turned to address the assembled representatives. Then we'll have to give them one. How long do we have to prepare a presentation that justifies our existence to beings who can reshape galaxies? 4 hours, replied the station's sensor coordinator. Chen smiled, feeling the same mixture of determination and impossibility that had characterized every major human achievement. All right then, let's show them what happens when 14 species decide to build something together, and let's hope they appreciate art as much as they value efficiency. In the hours that followed, the galaxy mobilized for the most important presentation in its history. Every species contributed their unique perspective on why their collaborative civilization deserved to exist. Artists created beauty that spanned star systems. Philosophers developed arguments that incorporated logic systems that The judges arrived precisely when predicted, their 17 vessels emerging from subspace with the kind of mathematical precision that suggested they had been planning this evaluation for millennia. Each ship was unlike anything the Coalition had ever seen, appearing to be constructed from crystallized starlight and existing in more dimensions than human physics could fully comprehend. Captain Chen stood in the primary meeting chamber aboard Harmony Point, a space that had been hastily redesigned to accommodate beings who existed partially outside normal reality. Around her, representatives from every Coalition species waited nervously for the most important diplomatic contact in galactic history. The judges themselves defied easy description. They appeared to be geometric patterns made of living mathematics, constantly shifting between configurations that suggested vast intelligence operating on scales the assembled delegates could barely comprehend. When they spoke, their voices created harmonics that resonated in quantum space. "We are the evaluators of growth," they announced, their collective voice containing undertones that suggested they were simultaneously speaking in hundreds of languages. "We have come to assess the garden known as Galaxy NGC 4594 for potential inclusion in the Great Archive of Sustainable Civilizations." Tender of Worlds stepped forward to serve as intermediary, their stellar form noticeably dimmer in the presence of their supervisors. "Honored judges, this garden has developed beyond standard parameters. The species within have achieved unprecedented cross-cultural integration and collaborative growth." One of the judges, distinguished by geometric patterns that resembled fractal flowers, shifted their attention to the assembled Coalition representatives. "We observe this anomaly. 14 distinct evolutionary paths have converged into a single civilization matrix. This violates fundamental principles of biodiversity preservation. Explain the value of this convergence." Admiral Webb, representing humanity in what might be their final diplomatic exchange, took a step forward. "Your Honor, with respect, I think you're asking the wrong question. You want to know the value of convergence, but what you should be asking is, what can cooperation create that competition cannot?" The geometric patterns of the judges shifted in what might have been surprise. "Elaborate." Dr. Elena Vasquez activated a holographic display showing the restoration projects across Coalition space. 3 years ago, this galaxy was dying. Entire civilizations had been consumed by the Devourer collective. Species that had existed for millions of years were extinct. Star systems were barren. The biodiversity you value was being systematically destroyed. The display shifted to show the current state of Coalition space. Worlds teeming with life, hybrid ecosystems that supported multiple species simultaneously, and artistic collaborations that spanned solar systems. Today we have not only restored what was lost but improved upon it. We have created sustainable abundance rather than competitive scarcity. High Coordinator Zex Thule added their perspective, their crystalline form resonating with harmonics that demonstrated quantum-level cooperation between matter and energy. The judges evaluate gardens based on sustainability, efficiency, and adherence to design principles. We submit that collaboration has allowed us to exceed all 3 criteria in ways that single-species civilizations cannot achieve. Growthbringer Prime manifested through the chamber's biomechanical systems, their consciousness flowing through networks that incorporated technology from every Coalition species. We were created as tools for garden preparation. We became destructive when we lost connection to purpose. Cooperation with these species has restored our function while expanding our capabilities beyond original design parameters. The judges observed in silence for several minutes, their geometric forms shifting through configurations that suggested intensive calculation. Finally, the lead judge spoke again. "Your claims require verification. We will examine your civilization's sustainability metrics, efficiency ratios, and design coherence. You have 1 planetary rotation to demonstrate that collaboration produces superior results to competition." Ambassador Martinez stepped forward, her diplomatic experience recognizing the challenge they faced. "Your Honors, may we ask what constitutes superior results in your evaluation criteria?" The flower-patterned judge responded, their form shifting to configurations that resembled blooming fractals. A sustainable garden maximizes biodiversity while minimizing resource consumption. An efficient garden produces optimal outcomes with minimal waste. A coherent garden follows design principles that ensure long-term stability across multiple evolutionary cycles. Captain Chen felt her mind racing as she processed the implications. They had 24 hours to prove that their multi-species civilization was better than anything the judges had seen before. Your Honors, would you be willing to observe our civilization in action rather than simply reviewing data? The judges conferred among themselves in mathematical harmonics that created visible distortions in space-time. After several minutes, they reached a consensus. We will deploy monitoring constructs throughout your civilization. All activities during the evaluation period will be observed and analyzed. Begin your demonstration. What followed was the most intense 24 hours in galactic history. Across coalition space, beings who had learned to trust each other completely mobilized to showcase everything their cooperation had achieved. In the synthesis system, Dr. Vasquez led a real-time demonstration of ecosystem management that spanned 7 planets. Awakened constructs worked with coalition biologists to adjust atmospheric compositions, while gardener advisors provided guidance on maintaining perfect balance between competing environmental needs. The system's bio-network allowed resources to flow seamlessly between worlds, creating abundance without waste. On the Artisan world, Growthbringer Prime collaborated with artists from 12 different species to create a living sculpture that demonstrated how cooperation could produce beauty impossible for any single culture. The artwork grew in real time, incorporating musical harmonies from the Vorthak, mathematical patterns from the Etherians, biological aesthetics from the Thrix, and emotional resonance from the humans. Throughout coalition space, the Awakened demonstrated how their collective consciousness had been transformed by individual friendship. They restored extinct species not because they were programmed to do so, but because they had learned to value life for its own sake. They shared resources with struggling civilizations not for strategic advantage, but because they had discovered the joy of generosity. The evaluation reached its climax when the judges observed something unprecedented, a crisis that demonstrated the true strength of coalition cooperation. A massive stellar instability in the Kepler system threatened to destroy all the restoration work that had been completed there. In any traditional civilization, the response would have been evacuation and loss mitigation. Instead, the coalition responded with coordinated action that defied conventional physics. Awakened constructs moved entire planets to safer orbits while Gardner technology stabilized the star itself. Etherian phase shifting allowed populations to be temporarily relocated to parallel dimensions while Vorthak crystal singing provided the mathematical frameworks necessary to calculate impossibly complex gravitational adjustments. The operation succeeded not because any single species had the necessary capabilities, but because 14 different species had learned to think of each other's problems as their own problems. The result was a solution that preserved everything while actually improving the system's long-term stability. As the evaluation period ended, the judges gathered in Harmony Point's central chamber to deliver their verdict. Their geometric forms had shifted to configurations that suggested deep contemplation, and when they spoke, their voice carried undertones of something that might have been wonder. "We have observed unprecedented phenomena," they announced. "Your civilization has achieved efficiency levels that exceed theoretical maximums through cooperative resource sharing. Your biodiversity metrics show exponential growth through interspecies collaboration. Your design coherence demonstrates emergent stability properties that we have never encountered." The lead judge's patterns shifted to resemble a growing garden made of living mathematics. "More significantly, you have achieved something we believed impossible: sustainable abundance. Traditional civilizations face inevitable resource constraints that limit growth. Your cooperative matrix has eliminated scarcity through collaborative creation rather than competitive consumption." Captain Chen held her breath as the judges rendered their final decision. Galaxy. NGC 4594 will be preserved in the Great Archive as a template for advanced galactic civilization. Your model of cooperative growth will be shared with other gardens to promote similar development. The universe will be enriched by your example. The celebration that followed spanned 17 star systems and included species that had learned to party together with the same Enthusiasm they brought to everything else. But for Chen, the most meaningful moment came later, as she stood on the observation deck of the UES Harmony, watching the judges' ships prepare to depart. Tender of Worlds materialized beside her, their stellar form brighter than she had ever seen it.